Okay, so good morning to everybody for our third and final day of the virtual investigative interviewing conference for 2020, which has been hosted by my Cluedo. And shortly, we're going to be listening to a presentation by Dr. Andy Griffiths, who's calling us from the UK. And his presentation is called "It's Not Just About Being Nice, Getting Underneath Mindful Interviewer Behaviour." And he's going to be talking about interviewing suspects and some of the latest thinking in regards to the most effective way of talking to respondents and suspects. I would also like to do an acknowledgement of country and to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all meeting today. For myself and for the people at my Cluedo, we're on Gadigal land, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past and present and emerging, and to welcome any Torres Strait Islander or Aboriginal people who are joining us today. So Andy, I get my piece of paper. So Dr. Andy Griffiths completed 30 years in policing as a detective with a large UK police force specialising in interviewing and investigation. And he progressed to be the head of the major crime, then intelligence and organised crime departments, and served for over 10 years on the national advisory body to all police forces in relation to investigative interviewing. During his police service, he was a pioneer in the development of specialised interview training programmes and was awarded a PhD for research on real-life suspect and witness interviews. He's lectured and trained and consulted in countries as diverse as America, Armenia, Australia, Ireland, Iceland, and South Korea. He's also contributed to miscarriage of justice investigations in the United States, New Zealand, and in the UK. And he spent some time as a visiting professor at the John Jay College in New York, as an associate of the College of Policing in the UK, and a visiting research fellow at the University of Portsmouth, and an associate scholar at the New York University. And his CV is so long, I have 2 pages, so I just switched my pages. So that was at the New York University Asia Law Institute. He's got numerous publications and media appearances in the field of investigations and investigative interviewing, and it's an absolute privilege to invite you to speak to our audience today. And I thank you very much, Andy, for staying up so late to do this live, and I think it will be really appreciated by the attendees that they will have the opportunity to ask you questions at the end of the session. So I'll hand over to you now.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Harriet. I'll just share my screen and hopefully that will go without a hitch, as we always have got our fingers crossed, haven't we? So good evening to everyone who's watching live, or if you're watching this as a recording. And indeed, it's my privilege to be able to share some time with you and with Harriet, who is an old friend. So I'm going to start by referring to 2 of the previous talks in introducing my own. This week, I have heard Greg Lammy say that you can't get a resistant person to talk to you, and Patrick Tidmarsh, who talked about listening and explaining being very, very important interview skills. And both of those comments resonate and are relevant to what I'm going to say to you tonight. And so I think it's great that there's this level of integration from the presentations that you've had through the week. So what is my talk about? It's not just about being nice. Well, what I'm going to try and do this evening is take you into a very practical presentation about what interviewing is all about. I'm going to make some reference to research, but I'm going to try and make it very much down to earth, as it's the final session of the conference. As Harriet has said, I come from a police background. I led many major crime investigations, and those cases where they went to court were tried to the highest standard of evidence. And of course, we use lessons learned from mistakes made in previous cases when prosecuting those cases and those investigations. in such high stakes environment, those mistakes ended up with the development in the UK of the practice of investigative interviewing, which again I heard Greg refer to last night, and a move away from coercive interrogation. And along the way, suspect and interview models developed and were put into practice. As time passed, other countries followed. And now, some 20 years later, the term investigative interviewing is well recognized and is well used. And consequently, there's been an abundance of research that's aimed at identifying productive techniques. And this research has, of course, led to the model that Greg mentioned last night, PEACE, but also other models like the cognitive interview and variations by other forces. But common throughout that research has been the development of what actually works. Whichever jurisdiction you're from, whichever industry you're in, the same things work. And the problem, my slide went a second. And really, I'm just going to start with this slide here, which is a very, very, very brief summary of a lot of research, as you can see, conducted over a number of years, that all says the same thing, basically. And that is that empathy and a rapport-based approach is superior to a coercive approach. And so right back in 2002, a Scandinavian researcher actually spoke to convicted sex offenders. These were people who accepted that they'd committed very serious crimes. And so he went and asked them, well, what was it, which police officers were the ones you would speak to? And they talked about a humanitarian approach, empathy, as a positive influence on their autonomous wish to disclose. Again, so going back to what Greg said last night, it's absolutely right. If you respect the law and if you respect people's autonomy, you can't force them to speak. So here was a seminal piece of research that told us that it was empathy that worked. And again, I've deliberately included in here some Australian researchers. Mark Kebbell and his colleagues found similar when they didn't replicate the study exactly, but they certainly looked into it in the same way and found the same result. So these were people in high stakes cases who were in prison, accepted what they'd done, and that's what they said. And that's a very, very good perspective to consider, the perspective of the other person in the interview. And again, since then, Professor Goodman-Delahunty, who's spoken this week already, I know, has also done research which has shown that rapport-based approaches are more likely to secure cooperation from suspects, as was respect and due regard for procedural fairness. So again, a very, very similar result. And coming right up to date, in a study published this year, it's one of a number of studies actually by a lady called Bianca Baker-Eck, who has published with her PhD supervisors. Again, from an interviewer's perspective, and in this case, a police interviewer's perspective, but we can disregard their trade. I think it's what they do that's important. Experienced interviewers were surveyed about what they did that they thought was successful in an interview, and 92% of them mentioned empathy as being important to their techniques. And in that case, empathy was defined as the following on the slide there. You see, it was things like listening, being non-judgmental, understanding the perspective of the other person, working together, a very interesting phrase that I'll come back to again, and rapport and understanding actions. Now, one of the nice distinctions in this latest study is that Baker-Eck and colleagues distinguished two types of empathy in this study. One was a cognitive empathy, and the other was an affective empathy. And the difference between those two is quite important. Cognitive empathy is rational. Cognitive empathy is logic. It's having the time and the consideration to think through from the position of the other person. And so there is a logic to that. It's not a sentimental emotion. It's not a sympathy. It's a logical process, that objectiveness, that open-mindedness that good investigators have. And then effective empathy is different. That is about feelings, and that is understanding how somebody else might feel. So again, that's again subjective, but it's been able to have that perspective. Now, all of these things are to do with a state of mind, and that's the point I want to take away from this slide. Is these are to do with a state of mind. So now we're going to just change tack slightly and look at training. Now, this is a slide from my own research, and what this slide shows you is one second, it's not allowing me a laser pen tonight. That's weird. Okay, I'm going to use my cursor instead. You can see here that this is showing the difference between the skill levels of people who've gone through interview training before and after. So you can see here on this side, this is before people were trained. This scale here represents a score from 1 to 5, where 5 is excellent and 1 is very poor. Here you have the categories that were involved in the training. So you have things like compliance with legal procedures, but also you have rapport, and you have a structural skill of structuring topics in an interview. And you will see here that all of these facets improved in this group when they were trained, which is really good news. But what I want to point out particularly is you see that before training, rapport was the worst performed of the skills, and it saw the biggest increase through training. And this is really important, because what this tells us, amongst this group who weren't bad interviewers before their training, the training they got saw a big increase in their ability to display rapport and these issues that Baker Eck mentioned in the previous slide. So that's just simple 3-week training course, and you'll see. Now, what I'm going to show you now is what happened later. Stand by. A little bit of button trouble there. These are the same people 18 months later, and what you can see here is that this is the same test that they undertook at the end of the previous slide, the end of their training course. And again, you see they're skilled interviewers, this group. But look what happens over 18 months is that without any refresher training, their rapport skill level was the biggest loser, if you like, of time. Other things, for example, their ability to follow the legal rules, their ability to introduce an interview properly, stayed quite reasonable. There was some drop off, but I can tell you in statistical terms, these were not statistical faults. This was. So again, what that showed us is that these interviewers who were detectives were not great at rapport to start with, and picked it up from a training course and then lost it again. But they were still at a good level at the end, but it shows what a fragile skill rapport is. Similarly, you'll see here, again, this is a similar stuff, just wrapped up in a different way. Here, you'll see that conversation skills, which includes rapport, again, dips after training. Whereas things like the use of questions in my research stayed quite static in terms of the level in the way at which it was performed. So these are the only stats I'm going to show you as such, but I'm just using that to say that what we've got here is the fact that we've got research that demonstrates how important empathy is. And then we've got a training course which demonstrates that it's a fragile skill and it's hard to grab hold of. and that deteriorates after training. And really what I want to look at tonight is why is that? What's involved in it? And why is it so difficult to master? So I'm going to start then sort of moving away from these stats now into the rest of the presentation. So we're going to bring this right back out of policing to any sort of interview. This is important that I emphasize that's what I'm talking about tonight. I've shared some research from high stakes cases, but it's not all about that. So I think you can say that whatever industry you're in, an interview in a professional context is any one of these things. You know, you wanted to use it to gather information, but actually in real life, you also use it to test evidence. And again, I heard Greg talk about respondents in discipline cases. It's exactly the same. You will be testing some of your evidence through an interview. Sometimes it's legally necessary as part of a process, whether it's giving a respondent an opportunity to answer an allegation, or whether it's complying with criminal law or a company policy, whatever it is, organization requirement, can also be there for transparency. But in all of those things, it is this. It is a conversation that's goal-driven. And the first point to pick up from this here is that the research on empathy is showing that empathy is a conversational skill that needs to be taken in to the interview. But what we're seeing from the research I've shown you is that sometimes we teach interviewing through teaching open questions, through teaching how to structure a topic, through teaching the things, sort of things that Greg talked about last night. But in actual fact, underneath it all is a very, very important conversational skill that even people who are convicted of the most serious crimes tell us is what makes the difference. So we need to remember that an interview is a goal-driven conversation. You need to do all the professional requirements of the interview with the investigation, but you mustn't lose track of the conversational parts of it. So, you know, for me, all successful interviewers understand the mechanics of conversation. Yes, they take on their training, but more than that, they understand that their attitude in a conversation is the major determinant of success or failure. And it's wrapped up in this issue of empathy. Yes, we need to know how to use evidence, but there's more to it than that. So I'm going to really go on to talk about the difference between mindful and mindless interview behavior. And I'm going to demonstrate that, hopefully. So let's move on a little bit. If you're going to be successful as an interviewer, you need the full participation of the interviewee. And we just demonstrated from the research, now we know how to get it. And as Greg said, you can't make reluctant people talk to you, but I say you certainly can influence them by demonstrating these proper behaviors. So, you know, let's look at conversation to start with. First of all, conversation is a French word, converser, and it means to keep company using words and deeds. So immediately what we get from that is the fact that interviewing is much more than just the ability to ask an open question or the ability to recognize an open question. If you ask those open questions in a wooden, rigid, or inconsiderate manner, it is not empathic. It is not conversing with words and deeds. Similarly, if you ask open questions, but have a bad body position in terms of the level of interest you're showing to the interviewee, and I'm looking at Harriet on camera now, she's got a fantastic body position showing interest in what I'm saying, then you know, it's no good. So it's more than words. That's what you need to do. First thing to recognize is there are two channels of behavior. They are the verbal and the non-verbal channels of behavior. And you know, the sort of things that you do with your body as well as the words you say are so important in doing this. And very often, you know, your body language is going to be much more impactful than the words you say, and certainly needs to be taken together. I've obviously used this rather demonstrative lady in this clip to demonstrate this, but this is what when we're talking about these things, we need to get these points across. Put simply, you know, your verbal vocal communication is the words and phrases that you speak, and your verbal non-vocal communication are those signs and gestures that I'm using now that illustrate what we say. And that's because our vocabulary is insufficient to say everything we want. And so this body language is essential as part of our message. So again, this is something else that we need to not leave at the interview room door. Where you go into an interview, you are still the same person. And I think with some of the training, what can happen is people become robots, where they just aim for these strict technical skills they've been taught and drop the other stuff. Your non-verbal communication is more complex than the verbal. That consists of things like the speed at which you speak, the tone of your voice, the pitch, things like that. And certainly, again, I've taught people in interview courses where, yes, they can ask open questions, but actually they're so robotic and wooden that you can detect there's no interest and no real enthusiasm behind what it is they're professing to say. So that non-verbal, non-vocal communication area is the most complex, and you need to manage it as an interviewer. It also includes things like touch and the distance we have. So again, I'm referring a lot back to Greg because he did such a great job last night. He talked about the read technique, and in the read technique, you know, part of that is about moving closer to people and touching them as a way of trying to engender trust, but it's completely insincere, so it doesn't work. You need to be very careful about the distance you keep when you're talking to someone, because touch has to be invited. And if you touch or move close to people without being invited, it is not empathic. It is not going to encourage them to disclose. So they're really, you know, your overall communication message is a very important part. And I'll leave with this point that 30% of your communication is verbal and 70% is non-verbal. So again, when we're talking about empathy, we're not just talking about saying the right things. We're talking about a consistent body and vocal message that conveys to another human being what it is you're about and whether you're genuine in any empathy you're expressing. So remember that only 1/3 of your message comes from your mouth and the words you say, and a vast majority comes from other things. So really, those messages you convey are also part of a relationship message. And relationships can be either up, down, or equal. And you know, you're in a position where if you try and dominate an interview, it can come across as very up, down. And that tends to make people stop talking, because when you're in those up, down situations, you revert back to where you learned things as a child, that, you know, if you were asked certain questions like, you know, did you hit your sister? Have you done your homework? That when you told the truth, you got into trouble. So you limited what you said. So certainly any question from you as an interviewer of an up, down, trying to exert power in the dynamic is not going to end well, in my view, in terms of disclosure. You also have a power dynamic in professional situations like doctors and patients. You know, again, a doctor might tell you very bad news in his professional position. So it's not always about being nice to people. It's about having the right type of relationship. And again, the relationship we are seeking to have is in a cross relationship where we are definitely trying to have that, remember that working together from the first slide? This is what you want to do with the interviewee. You are trying to work together to get them to disclose the information that you need. You need it not for an insincere or a coercive purpose, like a confession, like in those coercive interrogation techniques. You need it to progress your investigation. So that's the rationale, and that's the working together part of the relationship that you're seeking to emphasize with your behavior and the way in which you approach it. again, so now let's go on to some parts. Let's look at the way you introduce yourself in the interview. Now, the way that people introduce themselves linked to this power dynamic is important. It's symbolic. If I was to introduce myself now as doctor, or my old job, Superintendent Griffiths, it's very formal. It's my title and my second name. Those titles sometimes, are necessary in the right environment, but they infer status and power. So, when they're used in a benign situation, maybe okay. But certainly as an interviewer, if you're introducing yourself as investigator and second name, you're not doing anything to get that relationship, that across relationship. You're emphasizing I'm the person in charge here. If I alternatively introduce myself as Andy Griffiths, it's much more consultative. I'm sharing both my given name and my second name, and I'm inferring that it's okay to call me Andy. I can emphasize that. If I then say, and I'm the investigator working on your case, I've then also provided some information that explains my role, but I've put that at the back end rather than emphasizing it first. In that way, it's sort of helpful. You can go the other way, just introducing yourself, for example, me as Andy, that's not enough information in a professional environment. Somebody's entitled to know your full name. They also need to know what you do and what role you have. So that's too casual for that. But of course, it's great for the pub when all we need to know is who's going to buy the rounds, or if they call my name, here's my drink coming. Similarly, nicknames, my nickname's Griff. When I played sport, and to my close friends, that's what I get called. Obviously completely inappropriate for that situation. And then again, we talked a little bit about touch. Let's go back to that and extend that a little bit to social proximity. So again, here's some pictures demonstrating a little bit late because I didn't press the button, as to the various different scenarios where you use different versions of your name. Coming on to this now, the way in which we relate to people is also symbolic. So if you're touching someone up to a distance of 18 inches or 45 centimeters, that's considered to be intimate space. At that distance, you can whisper. Your awareness of smell and heat is there, and encroachment into that space without being invited is not welcome and can also be intimidating. 18 inches to 4 feet, so it's 45 centimeters to a meter roughly, is the zone of personal relationships. It's close enough to converse confidentially at normal volume. Gaze is more important at that distance, but body odor is not noticeable. It's not an intimate space. And then 4 to 12 feet is considered, it's 1.2 to 3.7 meters. I'm just giving my notes because I'm an old-fashioned person like that. That's social space. This is it's too great for one-to-one communication, but it's fine for social conversations, a bit of close teaching, that type of thing. Of course, we're thousands of miles apart now, but we're using Zoom to close that distance. But I can promise you I wouldn't encroach into your intimate space. So in all of those distances, it's all, you can vary it by going back and forth within they're zones. They're not exact measurements. They are also culturally sensitive in that you can change them when you're in different cultures. Again, it's not scientific this as such, but there's a suggestion that Latino and Asian cultures tolerate being closer distances. British and European, not so much. America, somewhere in between. In any research I've done on that. So that's a little bit about proximity. And again, you might say to me, is this all relevant to my role? Well, here's some research for it. So some researchers did research on American police officers standing at these 3 different points of social proximity and then moving into the different areas. And what they found, when the police officers moved from social to personal to intimate towards a citizen, the citizen's gaze was averted more often, their speech was disjointed and disrupted, became more nervous, and they employed increased head movements very often. Why is that relevant? Well, because those behaviors are historically associated with lying. And in some pseudoscientific interrogation manuals, they are your guilt indicators. And so if you're unconscious and mindless as to your social proximity, and then prone to using pseudoscience, your mindless encroachment into someone's personal space could result in these behaviors and change your mind about the case you're investigating. All completely predictable if you look at the research, but not if you're not aware of it. So again, think about where you are in relation to people. Think about, particularly if you're a big person, you know, if you move towards a smaller person, that closeness is exacerbated because even the light can change in a room. And these are tiny, tiny little things, but they're all into that empathy, working together, rapport-based behavior that we know is so important. So let's talk now about fostering conversation. I'm going to move on a little bit into some of the stuff that I really want to tell you about. When you're talking in conversation, it is much more than the words used. It's this multi-dimensional exchange that we discussed. And things like back channeling are so, so important to that. So, you know, you can use your body language, your non-verbal behavior to regulate the conversation in a subtle way without exerting domination and control over it. So things, simple gestures like leaning forward to show interest and eye contact, as I touched on already, are so important because they foster conversation when done positively. So, you know, leaning forward, using hand gestures to punctuate the conversation, pausing of different durations, they're fostering behaviors done positively. In the same way they can be negative when done sort of in a domination way. So things like eye contact here are really important, you know, so you can see that the eye contact and the occasional look away, we're not talking about staring. There is a difference between eye contact and staring when you're doing these things, is so important. Now, again, listening, we've talked about eye contact as part of listening. Listening consists of several different activities, gaze being one, but the other one is this back channeling. Now, these are supportive comments and behaviors that encourage disclosure. You know, if you're again sitting there just thinking about the next question you're going to ask, you're not supporting the person opposite you in the talking turn, and that's what they need to keep disclosing. So things like a smile, a nod, an I see, even a carry on are very important phrases in conveying the conversational message that it's still your turn to talk. That is so important. Now, one of the things that happens frequently when I train interviewers is if you as a listener in a conversation are more concerned about what it is that you're going to say, you will tune out from what the other person is saying a few milliseconds before you start to speak. And that has a very practical effect because it means you've stopped listening. So if they say something important, your cognitive capacity has been turned towards what you're going to say. So again, this is why when people talk about pausing, that's why they're talking about it as being so important, because the pausing at the end of somebody else taking is to allow you to finish listening to what they say and then formulate your question. And so again, if you start clipping somebody else's utterances or even over talking or interrupting them, you're doing two things. One, you're showing bad manners, and two, you are also not listening. Again, Greg talked last night about a negotiation tactic of if somebody's off tangent, let them finish what they say, then bring them back. That's exactly consistent with this. This is what you should do is listen to them. And if they are off topic, bring them back at that point. Resist interrupting unless it's absolutely disruptive behavior. And again, let's now talk about the content of conversation and the way of fostering conversation. You know, all conversation has topics, things that you need to discuss. And this is true in a crime interview, in civil action interview, or in conversation. And you need agreement to progress those topics. So again, this is where you are working together to progress them. Now, unfortunately, people do have topic narcissism in that in social conversation, it's very common for people to just talk about themselves. This can be mildly irritating or extremely disruptive. And again, when I'm training, I ask people to think about people they enjoy talking with and those they don't enjoy talking with. And very often senior managers come out in the don't enjoy talking to, but I'll leave that for your personal consideration online. You know, but skilled conversation sees you cover topics of choice that both parties want to cover. And again, this is linked into interviewing by starting with the interviewee's agenda, not introducing the accusation or presenting what you think has happened. So this is an important part of conversational behavior. And so, you know, whether it's a conversational topic about a new puppy or an important interview of whether someone's going to lose their job, it matters the same. You know, it's absolutely important to get your point across at the right time, but to have due regard for other people's topic choice. And again, when you're changing topics, there's a way of doing it. You don't need to be, you shouldn't be abrupt. It's about, well, that's great to hear about your puppy, but now let's talk about my puppy. Or if, yeah, look, thank you very much for telling me about a situation in another office that you know, you've heard about. I want to bring you back to talk about this incident that we're investigating today. So I think that's the that's a little stuff there on topics and how to close topics. And again, when you shift topic, again, it's you introduce it in that fostering call. Now, you know, I'd like to bring you, let's talk about this incident. I'm under investigation, and so on and so forth. Also with conversations, same as with interviews, conversations shouldn't close abruptly. You know, think about when you have a conversation with someone, you don't just walk off at the end of it. You generally wind it down with some sort of indication that, well, oh, is that the time? I really must go, or it's been great to catch up, but actually I must catch the last bus, whatever it is. You introduce the fact that the conversation is going to end. You need to take that behavior in an interview. You don't just ask your final question and then turn the recording device off if you're recording it. It's called pre-closure and then closure. And important in that is to be positive about what's happened. So again, in the same way as if the person has given you a full account of all the issues you wanted to cover, or whether they've been disruptive and not giving you everything you want, you need to be thankful. You need to express positiveness about what has happened by saying, well, look, thank you for talking to me, or thank you for listening to my questions. That's being positive. It's also putting yourself in their position. You know, would you have answered the questions if your job was on the line? Would you have completely disclosed everything you know about an incident if you didn't know what was going to happen at the end of it? So understand people's reluctance to talk, but be thankful for them spending the time with you and for listening to your questions. And then explain what's going to happen. That's the other part of closing, explain what's going to happen. So we've gone through there a bit of a whiz through really of some fostering conversation behaviors linked to that research on empathy that I hope translate into your personal environment. What these all add up to is a conversational mindset. And this is going to be my last subject that I'm going to cover this evening. It's about conversational mindset. The basics of conversation amount to a conversational mindset. And it's this conversational mindset that's really, really important. So let's have a look at this now. Conversing with another person can be seen as this. You can either be mindful, where you are concerned about the other person, or you can be egocentric, where you're concerned about yourself. Just think about that. You are all somewhere on this line. If you are worried about your own competence, nervous about the situation you're in, worried about getting off work on time, you are going to be down here because your thoughts are turning towards yourself, and that's going to change your behavior. If, on the other hand, you are mindful about the person you're interviewing, considerate of the position they find themselves in, then you're going to be up here. And this is definitely going to lead to more positive behavior without anything else, without knowing any of the technical skills. Your general behavior will be more considerate if you're at this end of this scale. So again, Professor Shepherd and I, we use this when we train. I could do a whole interview course based around your level of consideration for other person, but we've taken it a little bit further than that. Into this. So this is what we call quadrant behavior. And you will see here that this has got the same self-concern or other concern as a middle axis, and then a center axis on the left-hand side of which is mindless, and on the right-hand side of which is mindful behavior. And we've taken it a stage further in that across the top are speaking behaviors, and across the bottom are listening behaviors. So what we can do is we can map into this graph now speaking and listening behaviors that are representative of mindful or mindless behavior. So let's have a look. So there we go. In the mindless speaking behavior, these are the sort of things you would expect to see. An individual who dominates the talking turn, who is egocentric in that topic progression. In an interview sense, this is someone who introduces the evidence, is not really interested in what the interviewee says, just wants to get their evidence across and ask generally closed questions about whether the evidence is right or not, or maybe even express their view. Their questions are closed because they don't want to hand over the talking turn. They want to ask closed questions that get brief answers because they think that by being in control, they get what they want for the interview. In the worst cases, they'll overtalk and interrupt. In the worst cases, not always. Similarly, they'll talk at a pace that suits them. Fast, using technical terms, moving around between subjects, not being concerned about the interviewee on the other side of the room. Then, in terms of their listening behaviors, you have an absence or minimal of those back channel and supportive phrases that construct good behavior. You won't have those guggles, those nods, those encouraging phrases, or they'll be extremely rare. You have an assumption of meaning. So they'll take a minimal amount of an account and then expand it to fit with what they think the person was saying without taking the time to listen more and get all the detail. Generally minimal pausing in their listening behavior. They come in straight away, and they might even show a disinterest behavior when they're not talking. So looking at papers, excessive note-taking, looking away, looking at their watch, that type, even looking at their phone. I've seen that done. So there you have those. On the other side, we have mindful speaking behaviors. And again, we could teach a whole interview course on this. This is the interviewee who doesn't need to be speaking. Very comfortable to vacate the speaking turn and leave it with the interviewee. After all, it's their information that makes this interview. They're open to the other person's topics. Now, that doesn't mean sacrificing control in a disciplined sense. What that means is considering another way of approaching the interview. So they're flexible. If the interviewee introduces a topic that's not within their plan, they're not worried about it. They'll go with it because they're thinking they're seeing it from the other person's perspective. This is the way they want to explain it. Those supportive utterances are there in abundance. They're a regular thing throughout, not just when they get the answers they want. They don't overtalk or interrupt. They really protect and preserve the talking turn. They keep to the topic, and they go at a pace that's empathic. They also actually use simple speech, use very, very simple phrases and questions that are easily understood. Again, seeing it from the other person's point of view. In their listening behaviors, of course, they're attentive. They back channel. they encourage disclosure, they understand the detail, they demonstrate empathy, and they recognize the effect. They recognize the other person's prosody, that the speed, the pitch. So if emotion starts to come into the other person's voice, they pick up on it. If the other person starts to slow down in their speech, they pick up on it. Are they getting tired? Do they need a break? Is this a very, very emotional part of the interview? And of course, there are lots and lots of pauses that show reflection and thinking. So you can see here that the big issue between these two things is control. And again, I very often write the word control on a whiteboard if I'm starting an interview course, because empathy is all about control. And if you try and exert control, regardless of the situation, you are not empathic. You are not working together. You are doing that up-down thing where you just proceed with your concern, your agenda, and that's what you're going to try and drive through. So let's put all those on the screen so you can just digest those for a minute. You can see them next to each other, and you can see, you might think of others, but these are examples of the types of behavior, and we call this quadrant behavior. And you really want to be consistently here, consistently on the right-hand side of this there, where you're empathic in everything you do, both cognitively, rationally, and effectively, emotionally. And some people just don't have that, I'm afraid, but that's a conversation for another day. But you certainly can. And so when we go back to that training, if I was to make a criticism of the training that I was part of leading, we really focused on the technical skills. We taught people rapport, but we probably taught it in quite a cold, cognitive way, as opposed to the effective way. Probably didn't spend enough time on the effective side of it. And if I went back, I'd do more of that, actually. But now, you know, we know so much more. We don't have to make those same mistakes. This is so important. I'm going to just move on now to this is a very, very old theory. It's a very, very old model, but it's so suitable for what we're doing today. This is Batari's model, or Batari's theory, and it's one to remember. Simply this, that your attitude affects your behavior affects other people's attitudes, and therefore their behavior, and so on and so on. If you are trying to work together in an interview process with someone, you can't have it your own way. There is an effect of the way you behave. And as we know from the research, the effect of that, if it's negative, will generally be a less willing interviewee. Even if you're the best you can be, you won't always get what you deserve from an interview, but you should be above that professionally. You should be rising above that, and you should be always using this simple model. We all have off days. We all have off days, but generally your attitude is the single most tool you're going to take in there, because it trumps all these technical skills. So look, here's a little thing that I did to finish off. That's from the title of this. It's about mindful behavior. That's what it's about. So what I've tried to do here, and we've got time for questions, but what I've tried to do here is go from the research that shows comprehensively that empathy counts. Take that back into some real life research results that show you can train this, but it falls off if it's not a real commitment on your part. Then go back into general conversation to show you that empathy in interview derives from conversational behavior, and then bring it back round to, with the quadrant behavior, the types of mindful and mindless behavior that interviewers display, and obviously which is the one to be. So look, that is 22:53. I'm not quite ready for my cocoa, so I'm really happy to take questions or points emceed by Harriet. I'll just want to flash up two things. So that is a list of readings. So again, if that research at the start, I put the readings in there so you can go away and look at those if you want to. I know you're going to get the slides at a later point, so that'll all be there for you. And then similarly, I'm on Twitter, I'm on LinkedIn, and investigative interviewing covers all of this. We deal with conversation management in huge detail in there. I'm going to get shot for saying this, but Harriet knows we've rewritten this book, and the new edition comes out in Easter. So if you want to buy a book now, fantastic, please do. The publishers will be happy. But full disclosure, we've rewritten it, and there's a 21 edition going to come out. I think it's honest of me to say that. I'll go back here and hand back to Harriet.
Lovely. Thank you very much, Andy. And I'm just wondering if you might switch off your screen sharing, and then the participants can just see, they can just see us, which is great. So look, thank you ever so much for a really, really informative session, and really great information about empathy and rapport, and the things that really make the interview process. So we do have time for questions now. So if people want to pop some questions in the Q&A that they have for Andy, I know there was one put up there before from Angelino. And so Angelino said it might be a little bit off topic, and I think it might be. It was to do with asking, why do people insist on asking for surnames? So I think this was put up right at the beginning of the presentation when you were talking about introducing ourselves, and this insistence. So you know, the power of the full name and the family name or surname, as opposed to just using first names. So I don't know if you have any comment that you want to make on that, Andy.
Well, I think in a professional sense, if you're engaged in a professional conversation, then I think that it's a protocol. We're not talking about a strong evidence base here with lots of research, but it's a protocol that, you know, in a professional environment, if you're speaking to someone, then they're entitled to know who it is going to be interviewing them, and plus their role in the organisation. So I think the emphasis of that part of the talk was about giving permission to use your given name. I think that's important for the equal relationship, and the second name side of it is to do with professionalism, as far as I'm concerned, and to do probably with official requirements, names on documents, that type of thing. Yeah,
I mean, I think it's interesting between, obviously I came from England originally, and when I moved to Australia, I was really struck by the fact that nobody ever introduced themselves as Mr. or Mrs. or Ms. It was always just their first names, which, coming from an English culture, was quite contrary to what I was used to. So there's obviously cultural differences in what's expected as well.
I think, and that's why I'm sort of a bit careful when I put that point, is that, you know, the cultural side of it, and again, it's changing. I think the generational side of it, I think, you know, a few years from now, it'll probably be different, because each generation develops their own protocols and what's the norm. It's obviously more casual now than it used to be everywhere, for definite. Yeah.
Okay, so we have another question here. So this is from Diane. Any tips about how do you go about mindfully challenging information provided in an interview?
Yeah, we absolutely. So the peace model includes something called challenge, and again, Eric Shepherd and I, we've sort of counseled against that, because some people can get very excited by the term challenge, and it can lead to challenging behaviour. So, but you definitely have to deal with anomaly. You cannot allow it to fester. So it's a way of introducing it objectively. Again, first of all, try and understand it. If someone says something that's contrary to the evidence, the first thing to consider is they might be right and your evidence is wrong. And one of the big problems in police interviews has been what's called an availability bias, is that just because the police have got 3 witness statements before they interview the suspect, they must be right and the suspect must be lying. So the first thing with any contradiction in an interview is to consider it from all angles. If at the end of that judgment it is a contradiction, then you raise it objectively, and it's not it's the phrasing, it's not I think or you are lying, it's help me out with this. Is that the problem isn't you. The problem is a piece of information that's between us that we understand differently. So we're looking at this problem together from different perspectives, and I want to understand it from your perspective. So just explain to me again is, you know, we appear to have these work records that say you bunked off for 4 days, you know, taking a holiday, and you're saying you did go into work, but you forgot to sign in. Can you see the problem that presents? That there's no record of you being at work. So how could you help me to understand that you were at work and something you did that would help us grow, you know, so you're explaining it as a problem, and the problem must always be the issue, not the person. And we do that when speaking to rape suspects who've raped people. Again, it's not about them being a rapist. It's about the fact that in that case, there's a very high stakes issue where the minimum prison sentence is 5 years in prison, and there is evidence that consent was not there, and you're saying it was. So help me understand that. And that's a very successful technique.
Yeah, lovely. Thank you, Andy. We have another question here from Deborah. In regards to nonverbal communication, if a person is not making eye contact or looking away, is there any truth in someone then telling a lie whilst modeling this behavior?
Gosh, how do I explain this? No. No, right. So the short way of explaining this is Pinocchio's nose doesn't exist. The science is unequivocal. There are no reliable non-verbal measures of deception. What there are plenty of non-verbal measures of stress. And that's what you're observing. Now, they might be lying. The stress can be caused by lying, but this is the difficulty. If you shorten the chain from behavior to diagnosis in such a way, then you'll make mistakes. And that's what the read technique does by doing that. So it's what we call a behavioral hotspot. So if you're interviewing someone and they start to behave differently to how they behaved previously, or there is a line of questioning that introduces a behavioral change, that is a hotspot. We are not saying don't react to it. It's probably the case to ask more questions, but you cannot diagnose what it means.
Okay, thank you, Andy. So we've got to 10 o'clock, and if there are any more questions, there's no other questions that have come up. And I just wanted to, Andy, identify for listeners that yesterday, one of the questions that came up was around tools for evaluating interviews. And I think the model that you just placed up around the quadrants was actually a really good tool to evaluate the interview process. And I don't know if you have any comment about any other tools that you've used to evaluate interviews.
Yeah. So again, we've done a whole range of studies and work on evaluation with my colleague Professor Dave Walsh. We did a couple of studies on reflection logs on people's self-evaluation. So I'll mention that first of all. Unfortunately, from the study we did, it appears that if you are not particularly skilled interviewer, your self-reflections won't be very analytic. So you need a bit of a Dunning-Kruger effect. We found it with a group of investigators we studied. So you need feedback. So how do you get? So there's a difference between feedback and evaluations. That's the first thing I want to say. Is that and then there's a further difference. There's a difference between the skills you portray and the operational or investigative benefit from your interview. So again, Eric Shepherd and I, we split evaluation two ways: operational evaluation and personal evaluation. If you try and do it all together, it gets very messy. The tool I showed you, absolutely, you could use behavior statements like that for a personal evaluation of your behavior. And there are various lists. If people want to contact me, I can provide them, which have that type of thing. If you've got a good supervisor or a good colleague, you can get into peer-to-peer evaluation, where you have to be honest. That's also good. but always separate that from where did this interview take our investigation. So separate the two. The quadrant behaviour is great for your personal behaviour. You can be a bit more scientific. I think Harriet's also given me the opportunity to say that I've got a question mapping assessment tool that was also part of my PhD, which has been very successful in assessing the skill of question usage by people and their topic coverage. And that's a very technical assessment that we use in training, where we absolutely can see people's questioning skill improve through feedback of a diagrammatic, it's software now, but a diagrammatic piece of evaluation. So there are lots of ways you can evaluate it, but understand what you're evaluating. That's my main message. Split up. How good am I versus where did the interview go? Sometimes you can get the right result from an interview and you've had an awful day. So don't confuse that success with your performance.
That's great advice, Andy, and thank you very much for that. So I think I'd like to just overall thank you for your presentation. And I think in terms of where it sat with all the other presentations, it's pulled together some of the previous work and really made that clear for listeners. So I'd like to release you from your late night session, and we're going to move into a very short close of the overall conference. But thank you very much for your time, Andy.
My pleasure. And I've dipped into some of the other sessions. I think you've done a great job, Harriet. So hopefully everyone's enjoyed it. And again, in these strange times in which we're living, it's been nice to get together with people, at least in this way. So have a good December and Christmas, everyone watching. Good night. Thank you very much, Andy. So for other people, if you'd like to just stay, I will be giving only a short summary really to the conference. And I'd like to do an overall thank you to all the presenters who I think have been amazing. I've learned so much over the last few days, and I'm sure those attendees have also taken away a lot of learning. So it's a big thank you to all the presenters. Also a thank you to the participants, for those of you who have come, and for those of you who are listening online at a later date. There's a lot of valuable information in the sessions, so that's great. Whilst I'm on thank yous, I also want to thank Simon for his technical support, and it's with great relief that we've had hardly any technical issues over the last few days, so that's been terrific. So in terms of a summary over the 3 days of what we've heard about, some of the big takeaways for me is the reinforcement of the importance of free recall as our primary source of information from all the people that we interview, but that now that space is moving a little bit more into the having a supported cued recall, non-leading recall from certain particular types of witnesses in particular. So those special groups, we heard about the needs of people with autism, children, and also Jane gave us some information about people who are elderly and how their memory abilities change over time and how we might adapt our interviewing techniques to accommodate those changes. We also heard yesterday about the flexibility and dynamic nature of the PEACE model. So most investigators would have an idea of what PEACE stands for, but actually delving into how you can really use it was covered nicely by Greg. And now we have, I think from Patrick yesterday, his presentation on sexual offending just shows how important it is for investigators to understand the nature of the behaviour that's subject to the investigation. And this is important not only for sexual offending, anybody who's conducting investigations into bullying and harassment, discrimination. They are also forms of offending behaviour that it really pays dividends to understand the nature of the offending so that you can gather the right evidence. So that was an important message I took away from that presentation. And of course, just now with Andy, we've heard about the importance of developing empathy, building rapport, but also being very cognizant of the conversational nature of interviewing. And so I hope that we all go away
a lot more mindful about how we interact with that process. And one of the models that he showed at the end there, I remember from my recruit training in policing, which was back in the 80s. So I think still very, very valid now, about how our own behaviour impacts on others, and it's a circular motion. So we all need to be very mindful of our own behaviour and what we bring to the interview process. So that brings me to feedback. So for some of the sessions, you will have received a feedback form via Zoom when you've switched off the session. But we're very keen to understand how the experience has been for those of you who've attended. And so we really ask you to fill in those feedback forms for us so that we can take away our own learning from running this, our first major virtual event. If you don't get those forms, we're very happy to receive anything by email as well, with any comments and observations that you have from this week and for any events that we might run in the future. I would also ask you to follow us on LinkedIn. So with the MyCludo organization page, you can follow that, and that will keep you, give you posts when we post other events that we host. And of course, if you or any of your agencies that have attended this week want any more information or training that's been highlighted through the course of the presentations, please get in touch, and we'll only be too happy to facilitate connecting with those presenters or designing something that fits your particular needs as they may have arisen. So I'd like to say a final thank you. I hope this has been a really beneficial week for you. And yeah, that's it. Have a great Christmas, everybody. All right. Bye.